On behalf of Geopolitical Futures, I'm Leighton Smith, and shortly we'll be talking with George Friedman on his latest book, The Storm Before the Calm, which is a great title. More than one person said that to me. Released in hardback at the beginning of 2020, it has recently been named one of Bloomberg's best books of the year of 2020. The author of the appraisal, Dennis Dansonet, president of Cubist Systemic Strategies, wrote, I find the perspective of taking quite a few steps back to see the big picture useful. I liked his earlier, The Next 100 Years, which applied his geopolitical forecasting to the world. This one focuses on the United States. Historical context can often clarify what seems like a uniquely confusing present. The United States is an invented nation with a great deal of dynamism and flexibility. I share the author's optimism about our ability to continue reinventing ourselves. George Friedman, the founder and the chairman of Geopolitical Futures, does that short summary please you?
Yes, it does, actually. I mean, obviously being named that pleases me, but more to the point, understanding the events that we obsess over each day really don't tell the story. You have to back up and see the entire picture, understand the entire unfolding, which means think in terms of centuries, and that's not easy. But there's a story that's unfolding that's very important and very different from the momentary hysteria that goes on.
You've divided the book into three parts: the invention of America, American cycles, and the crisis and the calm. You spent in the invention of America a lot of time on history. Did you feel that was totally necessary? And obviously you did, or at least it was to advantage. So was the reason that history is not as well known as it once used to be?
Well, I don't think it is that well known, but it's also necessary if you're going to make a movie not to start in the middle. To tell the tale, it has to begin at the beginning. And the beginning of the United States was a committee meeting, if you will, that invented the Constitution, that invented concepts like the right to pursue happiness, other meaning, and most important, that set the stage for the idea that you can invent a country. And that was at that time a very radical notion, and in some ways it's still a radical notion. New Zealand was sort of invented. It remained within the British structure. The United States broke free and invented itself, and that set in stage a long history of reinvention and failure and reinvention.
You start actually with that little story at the very beginning with regard to the comment that was made to, I believe, a lady who asked, "What have you given us?" And the answer was a republic, if you can keep it. Where is the United States now on that scale of successful retention?
Well, we are still very much a republic. We are the kind of republic the founders expected, a contentious republic. We're a republic that does not trust our government altogether, which the founders wanted to see. And we're also a republic where each of us arrogantly believes that we are the possessors of truth and no one else possesses it. So we are pretty much what the founders wanted to see: a nation that protects its freedom by not trusting the government and, frankly, by not trusting each other.
Let me dive into the swamp momentarily. Did the founders see the swamp?
The founders certainly saw the swamp. They feared it tremendously. They created a government in which the president, for example, is enormously weak, although very visible. He faces two parliaments, very rare, a Supreme Court, 50 governors. They feared the swamp by putting on limits. But history unfolded and posed a problem for the United States, and that was a problem in the 20th century: how to win World War II. This was an existential question because losing World War II would have been catastrophic not just for the United States, but for the world. And for that, we had to create what's now called a swamp, a vast government undertaking that basically nationalized the American economy, put experts in charge of everything, and won the war. But we never dismantled it. And we never dismantled it because we were afraid that the country would not prosper as much. And now we're in the position where the thing that was created during World War II no longer works, and where it has created massive animosity among the public. And so in this cycle, and I speak about things coming and going, in this cycle will be not dismemberment of the swamp, but controls and reshaping.
Is the swamp as bad as they were afraid of, or is it possibly even worse?
Well, the problem is not the swamp. I mean, that's a really nifty phrase that doesn't mean a whole lot. We're a country of 330 million, so necessarily our government is going to be much larger than it was before. That goes without saying. The problem is that its virtue is that it put experts in charge of various areas. And the problem is that experts see only those things that they're experts in. And most problems go beyond fields of expertise to different areas. So, for example, in this one, we had very good doctors seeing precisely what had to be done to limit the damage of the virus. They did not consider the consequences to society and the economy of social distancing. How do you raise a child at the age of 4 to the age of 6 or 7, wherever it takes, who has never had the pleasure of playing directly with children, the spawning of fear of other people, and of course the catastrophe of the economy? The problem of the swamp is not, as some would put it, self-interest. I think most of the people employed are profoundly committed to their area of expertise. It is that we've lost that generation of generalists. We've lost the lawyers who are not interested in the particular area but are looking at the whole. And so we solve problems, creating other problems, but still go back to the same experts. Expertise is the problem if you want to create a swamp. Critiquing expertise is very dangerous because it's necessary, but you can't let the expert rule because he knows, basically what the hedgehog knows. He knows one thing. It's not a fox. He doesn't know the whole.
Staying within the bounds of within the framework of the book is not necessarily easy when discussing it, because there are so many tangents that one can attach to. For instance, the experts that you made mention of, and they come in all fields, and the generalities that they're lacking is something that you targeted extremely well. But there seems to be a move. I think it was in place before the pandemic arrived, but certainly it has exacerbated it. There is a move to restrict other opinion than what the decided opinion is going to be. And it's not just the pandemic, it's other matters as well. But let's stay with that pandemic. Is it possible that the experts are taking all of us down the wrong path? And if they are, how does that fit in with the framework of your predictions?
America has always been a censorious society. We had, if you will, Joe McCarthy. We had, if you read Nathaniel Hawthorne, we had the Protestant church crushing Catholic belief and other things. We have never been a society that is tolerant of other opinions. And sometimes, for a while, one faction can silence the other faction, but in the end, it's crushed. So, yes, we live in a time where certain ideas are forbidden by culture, okay? Mm-hmm. But we've always been in that time. There's never been a time from the beginning of the revolution when the sons of the revolution absolutely terrorized anybody who disagreed with them. This is how we are. This is the dynamic of the United States. Opinions rise, they crush other opinions, opinions rise. We like to think of the right to opinion, right to belief, as a kind of clean process, as a kind of tolerance. And it sometimes is, it frequently is. But believing in something also means that somebody else is wrong, and you must do something about it. Fortunately, we've always been able to transcend that, largely because of our constitutional provisions. But it really just isn't that different. I mean, all over the world, people believe in things, and out of belief, comes loathing for someone who disagrees. And we've had in the United States more than our share of that.
Just before we
But there's nothing new.
Just before we move on
No.
to part two, the American presidency and the position. I've always been at odds with you on the lack of presidential power, and I'm interested in your response. The president is an individual, supposedly a leader. Even credit is given to him for being the leader of the free world. And there is variation of leadership skills, so that the personality, the determination, the willingness to fight for what the president wants, all comes into it. So you have weak presidents and you have stronger presidents. So, do you include that in your summation of the weakness of the presidency?
Well, the weakness of the presidency is once you're president, you're not a king, and you're not a prime minister with a majority in parliament. You are a man sitting in a position hedged in by everything else. Now, there certainly were people who appeared weak and people calm, but every one of them had something in common. They fought through hundreds of millions of people to become president. I couldn't do that. Perhaps you could. But most people don't have the will, the strength, the overwhelming ability not only to seize his party, but to shape his party and become president. That requires an extraordinary strength. Now, how he chooses to behave at a certain time, well, it depends on the circumstances he finds himself in. So, for example, Joe Biden has got to not be Donald Trump. His entire presidency depends on he is going to replace Donald Trump, and he will act as differently as he must. But don't confuse Donald Trump's, Joe Biden's actions with who he is. He became president, and 330 million others didn't. So it takes a lot to become the president of the United States, and weakness doesn't show itself.
Well, there's one more point, and it's made overseas as much or even more as it might be in the United States, and that is this question has been asked many times, how could a country with 330 million people turn up with a choice between two such pathetic individuals? Not my terminology necessarily, but that's the question.
Well, I haven't met them, and the critics haven't met them, so I don't know what kind of personalities they have. We know what personalities they choose to present. But how that happened was quite simple. The United States went through one of its period social distinctions. On the one side, what I'll call the technocratic class, flourishing under the new microchip economy, flourishing through international trade. And other vast part crushed by this international trade, losing the industrialism that it had. These two factions were, as in previous times, profoundly indifferent to each other. The technocratic class looked at the others as social, moral outcasts, homosexuals, homophobia as the deplorables. And the others looked at these technologists as usurping the country and using it on their own behalf. You had a profound difference within the country, socially, culturally, morally. And that manifests itself in two wildly different people. So the question to ask those who say this is, who do you think could win an election in the United States? You had to be an advocate for one or the other. There was no other. And the problem with the Europeans, who I always trust, is no, a French president could not become president of the United States. You are going to be choosing between those people who could lead these two factions in a bitter battle that is still not over. That really began in the 2016 election with the bare victory of Donald Trump, the bare victory now of Joseph Biden, and we will be battling this fundamental issue for quite a while. And the people who are in a position to do so, well, Joe Biden has to speak quietly to the New York Times. Donald Trump has to speak loudly to Fox. They choose how to appear. And I think one of the most foolish things to do is to underestimate the will of an American president. it takes a lot to get there.
So the storm before the calm, moving on to section 2, America's discord, the coming crisis of the 2020s, and the triumph beyond is the subtitle of the book. The two cycles, the institutional cycles, the socio-economic cycles. Talk us through them, just briefly.
The institutional cycle begins with the fact that we had one relationship of the federal government to the states. That was followed by the Civil War, which redefined that relationship, asserting that the federal government controls them. And then in World War II, created another United States where the federal government had enormous power over society, necessary to win the war, and continue to govern. We are now at the point where that governance, for reasons we've already discussed, simply doesn't work. And one of the places it didn't work, the war that really changed it for us, was the wars against the jihadists. 18 years of endless fighting where all the experts agreed this had to be, and yet none of it worked. The failure of expertise in this particular case forces a redefinition of the federal government. And there's one most important part. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States states that you have a right to petition your government. It is impossible to petition the American government because it is so vast. The experts have set so many rules that the person you deal with has no authority, if you can find someone, to solve your problem. So in effect, the federal government has alienated society dramatically. And here you might go to your swamp analogy, although it's not the term I would use. What we have is a vast array of people who don't have the power to listen to your appeals. And so that has to be dealt with. Then you have the problem of the social and economic cycle. The social and the economic cycle is the previous cycle worked brilliantly. Reagan's transformation created wealth through cutting taxes on the wealthy and produced the investment capital for the extraordinary microchip economy we have. Well, that microchip economy is no longer new. It's a mature entity. It's 50 years old. It's at about the same age as the auto industry was in 1965. Productivity in the United States is not growing. It is time for a transformation. But the children, the spawn of that really is squatting on society, of course, just as General Motors once did. And they're enormously powerful. They also have to be transformed. So we will go through a social transformation where first we find a new cutting-edge technology because the microchip is no longer cutting edge, it's mature, and also one in which at least the children of the dispossessed industrial class have access to these places. And this will turn out to be a battle of the university. We believe in knowledge-based society. Universities own knowledge, and it is very hard for somebody from Arkansas who believes in abortion, does not believe in abortion, I should say, to get into those universities. Harvard University had a questionnaire that people on committees interviewing potential students would be asked, would you like to room with this person? Would you like to have dinner with this person? I mean, it was something from the 1920s. Is this your kind of fellow? And that's what Harvard and the great universities have become. Institutions of conformity in which the social origins of the students and the social beliefs of the professors combine. Well, this can't last. So we are in this crisis. Plus, we have a crisis in terms of money. Money is worthless. Interest rates are almost non-existent. So where there was a surplus, there was a lack of investment capital. Now in the United States, there's a surplus of investment capital. Everybody's looking to something to invest in and can't find it. So we're at that social crisis. It links to the institutional crisis. And that means because the two, for the first time, are bottoming at the same time, this is going to be a period of enormous pain, particularly social and economic. The political pain will be loud and noisy, and everyone will think it's the end of the world. But that's not the issue. We have to reconstruct our economies, our universities, and so on.
Would it be fair to say that Harvard, seeing you mentioned it, which is the epitome of the peak of university excellence, or it once was, that Harvard is actually eating itself?
Well, it's destroying itself economically. Uh, Tuition is constantly rising. It's rising because federal loans rise with them. At this point, students of any university can come out on the average, well, total $13 trillion debt. That's larger than the subprime crisis debt. So we're going to be in a situation where these universities can no longer sustain themselves as they did. I was a professor for a long time, I'm sorry to say. I taught 2 or 3 classes a week, half a year off. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation that the university is the most inefficient entity you can imagine, yet continues to raise the cost. Well, why do people go to university? Why do people go to Harvard? Well, because they can meet people at Goldman Sachs. It's because they can get the internships that they deserve. And those who go to a community college in Little Rock, Arkansas, will not get any of those opportunities. And that will raise the crisis. The fortunate thing about the United States is we regularly have these crises. We've been through them from the beginning of the founding. And the idea that the European concept that we're stuck in this class division doesn't work in the United States. It will transform and a new normal will be reached.
Well, you've introduced another question, and that is that you draw attention to what America's been through before and what generations have been through before and how they rose to defeat the issues that were sent to challenge them. I wonder whether at this particular point the American character is broad enough and strong enough to fight its way out of the current what I'll call deficit.
Well, the deficit is a separate question.
And I'm sorry, I'm not talking a financial deficit.
Okay.
I mean the deficit of strength of character as much as anything.
Well, in the 1960s, we saw riots in Detroit, for example, assassinations of presidential candidates, Martin Luther King, riots in Chicago, hatred between the counterculture and the anti-war movement in Middle America. And when we go back to the Depression, we saw the same thing. And so it's not new. So the question is, how does the United States manage to come through these crises that would break other countries? How did we live for 250 years with this, if you will? And the answer is, none of our institutions are locked in stone. Our institutions were designed to change. They were invented. Over time, they changed and they shifted. And there is nowhere within our concept of two things. First, there's nothing in the concept that says we can't have radical transformation. And the second that I love about the country is that no one respects the loudmouths except the loudmouths. So over the head of reality, the pro and anti-Trump choices are attacking each other as if what matters is who wins on that. Well, deep down underneath, massive social movements are taking place, as always. The flexibility and resilience of the United States was put into the system by the founders, by all the rules they had and all the things they demanded. And it also meant that controlling the government does not in any way you control society. And this was the important thing that happened in World War II. They went too far, and it'll come back. But we have presidents who can look weak, strong, dance a fandango, whatever they like to be. They're just presidents. And you can have congressmen who now have offices and everything else. But underneath them, you have something much more important: businessmen, scholars, fewer now perhaps than before, and a group of young children who don't give a rat's whatever, okay? In other words, what is happening in the shouting is not what is happening in America. The vast, interesting thing is an enormous number of American people didn't vote at all because they don't take it seriously. And the vast majority of people didn't care. They didn't believe that Trump's redemption or failure would change their lives. And this is the thing to understand about the United States. The founders created private life in the sense that there were two spheres: political life, the lesser place; private life, where you really lived with your beliefs, your churches, your businesses, whatever you do. And so when you take a look at the vote, okay, the single biggest vote was for nobody. And if you understand that all the so-called moral revulsion that you get out of the New York Times or that you get out of Fox or whatever, all the feeling that the world will end now. Oh, we had this before. This always sounds like that. That's how we do in public life. But in private life, we go on untouched. It is the difference. Any other country who would experience this sort of political event would shudder in their private life. People would be looking how it affects what they're going to do. The partisans, yes, they believe it makes a big difference. For me, it passed me by very nicely, and my neighbors, and our life goes on. And that's the difference. The founders created a sphere of private life that was intended to be as impervious as possible to political life. And they also didn't have any respect for politicians. And they were politicians.
Well, life goes on, you say, but life goes on with masks, which brings us to the pandemic and the release of the softcover edition of The Storm Before the Calm. When the hardcover was released in January of last year, you had no idea, because nobody did. Well, actually, some people did, but it wasn't widely known, that there was about to fall upon us a weight that we have never experienced before, at least not in our lifetimes. So you've got a scenario where your book came out. If you'd known in advance and could have included the pandemic in it, things might have been different. And what I'm driving at is now you've got the second edition. The preface covers all of this. Oddly enough, you say the pandemic has not undermined my forecast. It has accelerated it. Tell us.
Well, the institutional crisis, the manner in which it was handled. Dr. Fauci is undoubtedly an outstanding physician, but he has very little credibility because he proposed things that caused harms other than, and he could only imagine a medical harm. So what happened in this pandemic, and from Donald Trump's presidency, severe doubt about the ability of the federal government to function. Now it can, but you have the institutional crisis several years before I thought it would happen. Economically, I had forecast that this was going to be a period of severe economic downturn on a global basis. I had very little different reasons for saying that, and I didn't think it would be quite this bad. But what is most remarkable about the economic is we did not go into depression. A recession is one in which the various businesses survive to a great extent, okay? And financial systems will work to put you back to work. Depressions are ones in which entire industries are destroyed, unemployment goes to 30, 40%, and you live in it in years. What's interesting about this depression, which I did forecast for absolutely nothing to do with COVID, is that it is not nearly as bad as I thought it could be. That in the United States, in New Zealand, and so on, the businesses remain intact. You haven't had a wave of bankruptcies. We haven't had a wave of bank failures. We've had some of each, but we haven't had the systemic downturn from which it's very hard to recover. And I think the two things that we should see is the damage, I think, for most countries, not New Zealand, which apparently did very well, but for other countries, a complete lack of trust in the government, which was coming anyway. And in terms of the economy, we got the recession we were going to get on steroids, worse than I thought it was, okay? But also in a way, afterwards, we've cleared the decks. We will be able to start reconstructing the economy more quickly. So, no, I had no idea it was coming, but no, by pure accident, it didn't really transform what I said was going to happen.
Here's a short paragraph from the book. When the election of 2028 comes, the technocrats will be shocked at the outcome. And when the new government takes control, they'll be stunned at the speed at which the assumptions that they've lived by are overthrown. And because this happens once every 50 years, there will be a layer of the population who saw and remembers the events of 1980, which resulted in overthrowing domestic and foreign policy and turning the contempt that greeted Reagan into shock at what followed. And what follows will, as with Roosevelt and Reagan, maintain the core principles of America while radically changing how we experience it. So that's the election of 2028. Has the pandemic brought that forward? In fact, what I'm asking is, do we have to wait to 2028?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you do have to wait till 2028. Here's what happened. Ronald Reagan came in. He hurled the government against the wall, if you will, spilling it. He was then defeated. What came in next was a man whose primary job was to say, I'm not Ronald Reagan. I'm going to return things to normal, by which he meant the normal process that was failing, such as, the normal power of the technocracy, the normal, investment model that was in place, so on. So just as after you had the election of Richard Nixon, who was impeached, would have been impeached, thrown from office, certainly was a criminal, the country divided between those who felt that he was being railroaded by the Washington Post and those that felt that he was a criminal always and getting what he had. Same time as then we had Ford and Carter, two presidents who normalized, if you want to call it that, the political system. But underneath them, the economic and social crisis was fuming. So on the one hand, you saw with Trump, raging political system and a relatively stable so far social economic system. Now the reverse happens. Politics becomes very normal, and those who focus on politics as America will say, well, everything is back to normal. And on the other side of the equation, you will have the real power, the economic and social crisis, that's still going to hold together for a few years. It's not broken. Maybe it'll be the 2024 election, but I tend to think we're going to go through a period of political normalcy, if you want to call it that, and deep economic social dysfunction underneath it. And then we'll have an election.
So we began with a comment from Dennis Stansonet with regard to the books of the year for Bloomberg. And he finished his commentary, short though it was. I share the author's optimism about our ability to continue reinventing ourselves. Is this a book that would aid and abet particularly students?
Well, if I did anything, it was to put it in context. In America, there's always a feeling that there has never been a time as bad as this one, or there has never been a time as good as this one. We go to extremes. It tries to say, guys, we've been here before. It's not nearly as terrible as you think it is or you want it to be, nor is it wonderful. I mean, this is normal. But really, it's a failed book in that sense, because the energy that comes out of this feeling that everything has gone wrong, or the people who think that it's going wrong are monsters, this incredible tension is part of American culture. American culture lives by tension. It is constantly at war with itself, with each other, with nature, with history, everything. And that is not a very comfortable place to be, which, by the way, is why most Americans don't participate in that life. Most Americans don't care. They pull back into their own lives, which are fairly good and decent and so on, and they live them. So one of the things to get out of the United States, foreigners, is, oh boy, are we more complicated than you think. You think you know us, but you really don't.
The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 2020s, and The Triumph Beyond by George Friedman. The paperback edition released on January 12. And if you are interested in hearing more of George or reading more of George Friedman's writings, Geopoliticalfutures.com. Geopoliticalfutures.com. George, great talking to you. A pleasure. Thanks kindly.
Always good to be with you.